Colorama, a recorded books hybrid imprint, presents How Polarization Begets Polarization, Ideological Extremism in the U.S. Congress, by Samuel Merrill III, Bernard Grofman, and Thomas L. Brunell. Read by Thomas L. Brunell. Publisher's note. This audiobook contains references to visuals present in the print and e-book editions of the book. Acknowledgements. Academic research, unlike Athena, does not spring whole from the brow of Zeus. Rather, it builds on the work of many scholars. In particular, our own research draws on the considerable body of research we have done jointly or with other authors over the past 20 years. Sam Merrill would like to especially thank Jim Adams for helpful comments and for collaboration on two of the papers we outline in this book, one empirical and one theoretical, that deal with the within-district divergence of party candidates, especially in competitive districts. Tom Brunell and Bernie Grofman would both like to thank Bill Koetzel, with whom they jointly worked for a number of years before he left academia for the rewards of being a lobbyist. Bernie would also like to extend thanks to his long-term collaborator, Guillermo Owen, and his more recent co-author, Stan Weiner, for collaborative work directly related to party competition. In addition to thanks to these previous collaborators, from whom we've learned much, but who could not be held responsible for the flaws in the present work, and to the many scholars whose work we cite in this volume, we would particularly like to acknowledge the seminal work of Keith Poole and Howard Rosenthal, without which this volume would have been impossible. Tom Brunell would also like to thank Clark Benson for insightful conversations and oodles of data over the past 20 years. He would also like to thank Jason Sears for his help. Tom dedicates this book to Sandy Bracey, Max Brunell, Nate Brunell, and Chip Brunell. Bernie Grofman would like to acknowledge support from the Jack W. Peltison Chair of the University of California, Irvine, and the incredible patience of his wife, Sue, for enduring his disappearance behind a computer screen for most of the day, 7 days a week. Sam Merrill would like to thank Andrew Merrill for his invaluable help with computer advice. All three authors like to thank David McBride at Oxford University Press and two anonymous reviewers for persevering with us as we sought to follow their suggestions to make the text more friendly to a wider audience. Bernie Grofman would like to dedicate this work to the late Nelson Polsby, one of the greatest congressional scholars of the 20th century and not known for his modesty. Nelson once told Bernie that he himself had forgotten more about Congress than Bernie would ever know. Now, a quarter century later, it's hard to disagree with him. Nonetheless, were he alive, perhaps he would find the models in the book could tell him at least a few things about Congress that he hadn't already known. This book continues the attempt to integrate ideas from different research streams into a single model that was the intention of our two previous books, A Unified Theory of Voting and A Unified Theory of Party Competition. The first merged ideas about optimal party ideological location, derived from Downesian proximity models of voting, with work on directional models of voting. The second blended ideas from neo-Downesian spatial models of party competition with social psychology perspectives on party identification. The present volume integrates work on candidate competition at the constituency level with work on polarization between parties in Congress. Taken collectively, these books are intended to provide the readers with essential insights into voter choice, party and candidate competition, and voting patterns within a legislature. Part 1. Where did polarization come from, and why is it getting worse? Chapter 1. Making Sense of Polarization. Section 1.1. Introduction. That the contemporary state of polarization in American politics is viewed as a matter of grave concern cannot be in doubt. There are scores of academic articles and hundreds of journalistic essays condemning polarization. And there are now multiple books on the topic. According to the Stanford law professor and political scientist Nathaniel Persily, in the introduction to Solutions to Political Polarization in America, quote, political polarization dominates discussions of contemporary American politics, end quote. And there is, quote, widespread agreement that the dysfunction in the political system can be attributed to political polarization, end quote. But political polarization has not always been characteristic of American politics. A famous report from a committee of the American Political Science Association in 1950 called for a more responsible two-party system. As summarized by Arthur Schlesinger, Jr. in his review of the report in the Annals of the American Academy of Political and Social Science, quote, The committee's objective is to transform the present sprawling and illogical system into a centralized and logical system which will define alternative policies with clarity and will guarantee their execution through improved means of party discipline." End quote. One could say that this ambition has now been fulfilled. But it is also well known that getting what one wishes for can be dangerous, as Schlesinger also states eloquently in the same review. We now have widely separated and internally homogeneous political camps, each responsible to its respective base. But unfortunately, our politics is beset with gridlock, obstruction, and the inability to compromise to get things done. In this book, we highlight polarization in Congress and focus primarily on the first of these three aspects of polarization identified by Persily, namely, quote, ideological convergence within parties and divergence between parties, end quote, which he calls hyper-partisanship. But we recognize that polarization can be viewed as a multi-stranded concept, and that sometimes it is hard to distinguish the presence of polarization from its consequences. Section 1.2. Measuring polarization in the U.S. Congress. We begin with a definition. Legislative polarization is the ideological gap between Democratic and Republican ideologies, which is quantified as the difference between the mean ideological positions of the Democratic and Republican delegations in Congress, and in particular within the U.S. House, along with the intra-party variations within each of the delegations. To be specific, our primary measure of the degree of legislative polarization in the U.S. Congress is the difference, assessed in terms of roll call voting patterns, between the mean policy/ideological positions of the Republican and Democratic delegations in a one-dimensional spatial model. In this book, we focus primarily on the U.S. House of Representatives. The spatial model of which we speak places parties, candidates, and voters on a line, with points to the left representing liberal positions on policy issues or a liberal ideology, and points to the right reflecting conservative positions and ideology. A one-dimensional representation of U.S. party competition is an oversimplification, but social and economic dimensions of evaluation by legislators have become more correlated over time, with a single dimension explaining most of the variance in roll call voting. To determine the mean positions of party ideologies in the House, we employ the DW Nominate scores, developed by Poole and Rosenthal, which place legislators on a liberal to conservative scale from negative 1.0 on the left to positive 1.0 on the right. The legislator scores are based on their roll call votes, using an algorithm that provides comparability between the scores of members of Congress serving in different eras. The first dimension of the DW Nominate score reflects primarily economic issues and is conventionally used to represent a liberal to conservative continuum. Figure 1.1a, which can be found in the print and ebook versions of this book, plots the means of the first dimension of DW Nominate scores of the party delegations in the U.S. House from 1856 to 2020. These party means were at their most disparate about 1900 and again after 2000, whereas they were least separated from one another shortly after the Civil War and particularly for a period around 1940 through 1970. It is thus clear from the historical record that, in the U.S. House, the degree of legislative polarization has ebbed and flowed over the past century and a half of the modern two-party era. In particular, we note the apparent cyclic nature of the pattern of ideological change in the House throughout this period. Figure 1.1b shows that, furthermore, for both parties our secondary measure of legislative polarization, inter-party variation, was relatively small, i.e., variation within each party was lower, at approximately the times that partisan separation was at its greatest, during the late 19th century and, for the Democratic Party, at the beginning of the 21st century. Inter-party variation was high when partisan separation was low, for a short period around 1860, and again from about 1950 to 1980. Figure 1.1c places in sharp focus the inverse relationship between party separation and inter-party variation by plotting the separation between the parties and the pooled intra-party standard deviation on the same graph. The negative correlation between partisan separation and the pooled standard deviation is highly significant, as are the negative correlations between partisan separation and the separate standard deviations for Democrats and Republicans, respectively. Thus, typically, when Congress, and the House in particular, is highly polarized, variance within each party is low, That is, party delegations are relatively homogeneous. Despite the noise in the data, high separation between narrow distributions of partisans is characteristic of strong polarization. Reduced separation and broad, often overlapping distributions are characteristic of low polarization. Hence, a theoretical model of polarization should predict an inverse relationship between party separation and inter-party variance over the long term, as we will note from our model in Chapter 2. In the next section, we introduce the model. However, for purposes of conceptual clarity, we wish to distinguish polarization within Congress from ideological differentiation between the candidates of opposing parties at the district level. Party strategies for electing the U.S. House must accommodate races in numerous congressional districts, each with its own political makeup and district-specific ideology. National party constraints, motivated by national policy-seeking goals, when imposed on the campaign positions of local district candidates, may conflict with the interests of party candidates who feel the need to temper the national party position by shifting to be more representative of the district. In later chapters, we will consider the trade-offs of candidates and parties and judging how to balance between appealing to their base and seeking to win the support of the typical voter in the district. Section 1.3. Explaining the growth of polarization in Congress. How did we get to where we are now? Various explanations have been offered for increasing polarization that are specific to the past 50 years, following a decline in polarization in the previous half-century. In the appendix to this chapter, we discuss research concerning several suggested contributing factors, including income inequality, immigration, racial and ethnic divisions, and party leadership structure, that may have influenced the rise and fall of polarization, and, in particular, triggered polarization trends during the past half-century. Moreover, the growth of talk radio and politicized cable news channels, accompanied by declining audiences for the major TV networks, and the rise of tweets and other social media have led to a siloization of political communication that reinforces polarization to a remarkable degree. In sum, in seeking to explain polarization, we are blessed with a superabundance of forces and events to credit or blame. While there is a debate about how much of the polarization we see is only at the elite and activist level, and a related debate about the extent to which voter polarization lags or mirrors elite polarization, what can be said with confidence is that, over the past half-century, activists, party officials, and other power brokers have intentionally moved American politics toward what once was called ideologically responsible parties. Rosenfeld notes that in the decades following the 1950 APSA report, activists and politicians in the middle ranks of American politics, who had reason to think that forging disciplined, programmatically distinct parties would solve endemic problems in American politics, intentionally began the movement toward responsible parties. He recounts how, by effectively drawing new party lines across a wide array of issues, these activists helped to catalyze a partisan resurgence, first among Democrats, then later among Republicans. Slowly, these new responsible parties became identified with opposing issue bundles and became dominated not by non-ideological bosses, but by issue-oriented interest groups that imposed their own exacting discipline and more polarization. Furthermore, during the second half of the 20th century, party control was influenced by the replacement of many office-oriented professional political leaders by amateur activists and moneyed interests operating on their own. Both of these groups frequently had a deep commitment to policy change and relatively extreme views. For example, Morris Fiorina et al. Quotes Aaron Wildavsky about, quote, purist emphasis on internal criteria for decision and what they believe deep down inside, their rejection of compromise, their lack of orientation towards winning, their stress on the style and purity of decision, integrity, consistency, adherence to internal norms. End quote. In addition, think tanks and partisan media outlets, particularly on the right, have been heavily funded with private money with the aim of influencing party policy for the long term. Thus, movement towards ideologically distinct parties can be intentional, fostered by activists with strong policy views who at times wish to implement extreme policies, or by ideologically motivated media, for whom controversy increases audiences and who find it profitable to demonize the other side. In this book, however, we focus on the less well-understood processes that reinforce polarization, but that operate in a, quote, behind-the-scenes, end quote, fashion, and to which even the involved actors may be oblivious. Specifically, we focus on linkages between the level of party discipline on congressional candidates, forces that affect voter party loyalties, the influence of activists within each party, the differences between the candidates of the two parties at the constituency level, and polarization in legislative voting patterns. While a huge amount has been written about polarization both at the mass and the elite level, we believe that our approach, in which we view polarization as a complex system with many moving parts, provides original insights involving extensive modifications on the classic Downesian model of party competition, which we will discuss later. In particular, we focus on the reciprocal relationship between the level of polarization in Congress and the nature of political competition in U.S. House elections at the district level. But we also show why hyperpolarization can be expected to facilitate the development of extreme partisan loyalty and vice versa. Perhaps the epitome of this development occurred in the presidential elections of 2016 and 2020. Ezra Klein, in his book Why We Are Polarized, asserts, quote, "The fact that voters ultimately treated Trump as if he were just another Republican speaks to the enormous weight of party polarization now exerts on our politics. A weight so heavy that it can take an election as bizarre as 2016 and jam the results into the same grooves as Romney's contest with Obama or Bush's race against Kerry." End quote. Compounding party loyalty is negative partisanship, that is, disliking and even detesting the other party, its office holders, and indeed its supporters. When voters are loyal to their party and strongly dislike the other party, extremist candidates can be more easily elected. Alienation from mainstream ideology and increased activism by ordinary voters and wealthy individuals on the extremes bring about greater reliance on the respective blocks or bases that form in part from these previously alienated voters. The more the two parties separate, furthermore, the more the activists of the out party react to the extremism of the in party, and the less willing these opposition activists become to offer moderate candidates. The out party mean becomes more extreme, while the in party, relying on its safe majorities, dares to implement extreme policies. Out party activists demand ideological purity as a litmus test for its candidates so as to combat the quote-unquote evil in party. In turn, the in party activists, because they are already winning, see little reason to forsake ideological purity and seek to expel moderates from their own ranks. Also, as Fiorina et al. Argue, even if voters have not become more polarized in terms of developing more extreme views, quote, partisans have become better sorted into the parties, end quote. Such sorting has occurred in part because of activists' insistence on issues and on party responsibility, and on ideological purism, so that catch-all parties cease to be viable. Associated with the growing strength of ideological activists are other developments that often lead to more divergent party nominees, such as open, primary-driven, candidate-centric presidential and congressional nominating processes, accentuated by the reforms of the party primaries initiated by the McGovern-Fraser Commission following the 1968 elections. As the parties move further apart, party polarization at the elite level reinforces tendencies for the electorate to polarize, as sorting mechanisms shift voters into the party to which they are ideologically closest. In particular, voters whose policy attitudes on given issues are not that well anchored tend to adopt views on those issues that are consistent with the reference groups and the information sources to which they are most attuned, including the leaders in the party with which they identify. This leads to increased correlation among voters across multiple issue dimensions, such that not just party leaders and ideologues, but ordinary voters develop stronger partisan identities, since there are no longer cross-cutting cleavages that foster split-ticket voting. Such developments feed on each other, generating self-reinforcing positive feedback. In the model of party competition and its consequences that we offer, as party delegations in Congress polarize along ideological lines, national party discipline and expectations, as well as the power of activists applied at the district level, force candidates further and further away from the preferences of the median or typical voter in their constituencies. Change in the ideological location of each party's congressional delegation is generated by, and then reinforces, differentiation in the ideological locations of the candidates of the two major parties in each constituency. We make no claim that the electoral and structural factors on which we focus in this book are the only forces that impel polarization or that exacerbate its consequences. The alignment of partisan affiliation with personal identity along racial, ethnic, class, religious, or educational lines has served to buttress party allegiance against the influence of policy arguments and indeed against information and facts themselves. Significant as these factors are, their analysis is not the focus of this book. We focus instead on institutional factors that underlie the rise of polarization, but may be less visible. Factors that are tied to the existence of single-seat political competition under plurality, which we believe will give a fuller understanding of the rise of polarization, its perpetuation, and perhaps its eventual reversal. Our approach allows us to address the puzzle of why we get a pattern of steadily increasing polarization. By proposing a clear institutional mechanism that fosters party separation and legislative polarization, this approach provides clues as to how the increasing polarization trend might be reversed. Clues that augment previous recommendations such as those of McCarty, Poole, and Rosenthal, or Putnam and Garrett. Section 1.4. How does polarization in Congress relate to candidate polarization at the district level? At the heart of this book is a dynamic model that links polarization in the U.S. Congress to the nature of electoral competition at the district level. Our argument is based on the proposition that the positions of candidates of a given party can offer the voters in their constituencies are constrained by the national expectations of their party, as well as by the ideology of the constituency. When this constraint is relatively weak, as it was in the middle of the past century, Republican candidates, for example, can be competitive in relatively liberal districts, balancing and hence moderating their overall congressional delegation. Similarly, Democrats can be competitive in relatively conservative districts. Relatively loose constraints during the middle century era allowed quite conservative Democrats to continue to win congressional elections, many in the South, despite a national party position that was distant from voter preferences in those districts. Similarly, relaxed constraints by the Republican Party once permitted the repeated election of relatively liberal Republicans, such as Jacob Javits in the Senate and Silvio Conti in the House. Consequently, when a restraint is lax, as was typical during the middle of the 20th century, the ideologies of the party delegations overlap, and the gap between the means of party delegations is relatively small. That is, polarization is averted. But when the constraint is tight, as it is now, then the gap between parties widens. In fact, today, when the allowable tolerance for deviance from the party position is narrowed, even a previously popular and respected party leader, such as Liz Cheney, can be removed from her party leadership position and rejected in her constituency for being out of step with the party. The strength of party constraints also affects intra-party variation, with tighter constraints corresponding to ideologically concentrated party delegations. Hence, polarization at the congressional level is characterized by concentrated and ideologically widely separated party delegations, whereas unpolarized periods, party delegations are each broadly distributed and overlap. In turn, when congressional delegations are highly polarized, each projects a focused national image that is sharply distinct from that of the opposing party. This sets the stage for each of the two parties to espouse extreme views and be relatively intolerant of deviations from the party positions. We concur with Persily when he observes, quote, "In today's Congress, it would appear that not only are the parties far apart on the issues, but also that the ideological distance is matched by a widespread intensity of belief on a host of issues that might not have been seen as so fundamental and defining in previous eras." End quote. Thus, ideological polarization at the national party level typically leads to a substantial ideological differentiation between candidates at the district level, which influences which party's candidate is most likely to win in any given constituency. Success in the districts which is also affected by the ideological distribution of voters in the respective constituencies, in turn shapes the polarization between the parties in the next Congress. Insofar as the national ideological position of the party reflects that of the party's congressional members, divergence of those members implies that the anchors for the national party constraints likewise diverge. These anchors then drag the policy platforms of each party's winners yet further away from the preferences of swing voters within their districts. These forces generate a dynamic interaction, or a positive feedback loop, between district and congressional politics. Thus, over time, until checked or reversed, polarization begets polarization. Either one or both of the parties may be induced to take extreme stands by, for example, efforts of policy activists or power brokers to generate a, quote, more responsible party, end quote. That is, a party which is accountable to the policies of its strongest supporters. As extreme activists become more important in influencing the direction of the parties, the party bases become more polarized. As we will show in Chapter 5, if, for any reason, the latter conditions develop beyond a threshold specified by the analysis, optimal party strategies begin rapidly diverging from centrist towards more extreme ideological positions, with these positions representing the party's own bases rather than the overall electorate. Or to put it more succinctly, once a polarization threshold is crossed, office-seeking parties and candidates find it advantageous to put more emphasis on mobilizing their base rather than appealing to the middle. In sum, over time, we experience legislative polarization reflected in seemingly unbridgeable policy disagreements between the two parties, as well as votes on policy issues and confirmations that are sharply and often entirely along party lines. The electoral dynamic we model triggers a self-reinforcing pattern of polarization, a repeating cycle or feedback loop with increasing divergence, until altered by the political environment, either gradually or in one tectonic shift. Such a shift might be induced by the introduction of a cross-cutting new issue dimension, or by politics reaching extremes that generate a revolt by more moderate voters. More gradual causes could include changes in the demographic composition of a district's electorate. We will return to the possibilities for a reversal of polarization in our final chapter. However, our focus in this book will be on the institutional mechanisms that have created the current dynamic of non-decreasing polarization in Congress, specifically the U.S. House of Representatives, together with the consequences of that development. Section 1.5. Downesian Theory and its Extensions. Decades ago, Anthony Downs and others extended to two-party competition between political parties the idea of two economic entities seeking a middle ground in competing with one another. In the case of political parties, as stated, we assume that parties and voters locate along a one-dimensional policy continuum, a spatial model, and that, other things being equal, each voter supports the party whose announced policy is closest to his or her own position. Thus, a party that is motivated to seek office by winning an election has reason to move to the center, specifically to the location of the median voter, the middle voter in the spatial model. A candidate, adopting any other position, can theoretically be beaten by an opponent who approaches even closer to the median. This result is known as the median voter theorem, or Downesian convergence, as both parties would converge to the median. In general, forces that tend to draw parties towards centrist positions are referred to as Downesian pressures. Divergence, not convergence, of the two major American parties is, however, characteristic of American politics, although the degree of that divergence varies significantly over time. If parties focus on the policy that they can enact if elected, and if many voters vote according to party loyalty, based on retrospective assessments of past policy performance or personal or family history, parties may choose positions that diverge from the median. To assuage activists, moderate candidates may espouse more extreme policies. This effect was seen in the presidential election of 2020, in which the Democratic Party and its moderate nominee, Joe Biden, were motivated to appeal on policy grounds to the supporters of the more left-wing Bernie Sanders and progressives continue to influence Biden's policy proposals after his election. Many of our arguments are based on a spatial model will show that polarization motivates parties to move not only beyond Downsian expectations, but to even more divergent ideological positions. The explanatory models we provide predict such divergent party positions.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?